We are really appreciative of your being here. I am so sorry about the technical.
That's okay. These happen.
Yeah, it does. And thank you again to all the folks in the room. I again apologize deeply for the interruption. I will give an even more abbreviated introduction of Shirley Lindenbaum than I would have otherwise, because I want to just turn things over to her and the, as I said, wisdom that she has to share in this moment of pandemic, her based on decades of research as really one of the most foremost medical anthropologists in the world, with decades of research about a range of epidemics. In short, Paul Farmer, another relatively well-known medical anthropologist and doctor, has called Shirley Lindenbaum a total badass, and that's a direct quote. And I think that fairly well captures it. As many of you know, she's the author of Kuru Sorcery, Disease and Danger in the New Guinea Highlands, which is truly a classic in medical anthropology. That's all you need to hear from me, especially given the delay. So let me turn things over to Shirley Lindenbaum, and we thank you for joining us and for your time. It's really a pleasure.
Thank you, David. I hope you could all hear me. Most of that was untrue, but I did publish Kuru Sorcery. And it's lovely to be, it's a privilege for me to be interacting with some of David's students, and I trust you're safe at home and that your families are doing well. Okay?
Fantastic.
Some funny noise, but I'll keep going.
Please.
I thought I'd begin our conversation today by presenting my current thoughts about the assigned readings that David suggested, keeping the coronavirus epidemic in mind, in the hope that I might provide you with some interesting ways to think comparatively about another epidemic and COVID-19. That's a sort of a good way to generate new ideas. First, we could begin looking at the abstract of the essay that you might have read, Kuru, Prions, and Human Affairs, Thinking About Epidemics. You may not have it in front of you. I just want to talk about the abstract at the moment, so I'll read it to you. It's quite short. Begins with the statement, the study of epidemics provides a unique point of entry for examining the relationships among cultural assumptions, institutional forms, and states of mind. This thought comes from the great medical historian Charles Rosenberg. The abstract then continues with the observation that the Black Death is said to have contributed to the emergence of nation states, the rise of mercantile economies, and the religious movements that led to the Reformation. It may also have brought about new ways of understanding God, the meaning of death, and the role of religion in social life. Cholera induced a public health approach that stressed quarantine, and venereal disease led to contact tracing. Western medicine, however, failed to cure the epidemics that resulted from imperial expansion into the Americas, Asia, Africa, and Europe. Well, these are really big statements, and they're possible to make years after the event. Even so, it would be interesting, I think, to see what we're telling ourselves in the early stages of COVID-19. The culling of the media providing a record of current reports, assumptions, and understandings is what historians call contemporary history, gathered from exploratory thoughts we're telling us. And I think it's very like anthropology. So I sampled some of these and in a not very organized way, and in the middle to late March. And here are just a few of them. That in the business of national leadership, we were witnessing the emergence of governors, mayors, business owners, university presidents, philanthropists, and non-profit groups of all kinds to mobilize, guide, and protect those they lead and served. We were also told that we had resisted online education for years, but now found it to be a mode of communication that was being widely adopted and that one may have a lasting impact. We were told that we were already seeing a huge reduction in plane and car emissions as people stayed home, good for the planet, horrible for the airlines, but it might be a harbinger of changing social behaviors that may last. People may spend less time traveling, more time on conference calls, which leaves more time to do other things, presumably leisure, but also creative and productive activities. With business failures, which might be lasting, empty office buildings could be turned into apartments, resulting in a shift in residential arrangements that could transform our current patterns of urban-suburban work lives. As the days passed, the attention shifted to the need to train people who'd been laid off for better paying jobs, especially in people in key occupations. This would require education, coaching, mentoring, and advising across a range of employment. This theme was raised mainly by Democrats during the debate about the financial stimulus, suggesting potential changes in the structures of privilege in our current culture. Some work, for example, teachers were already fighting for better pay, recognition, and status, and it was suggested that teachers could receive pay and prestige like that of some CEOs. The concept of a basic income had been floated during the presidential debates, and a similar thrust came to the call for a program to identify families in need of supplemental nutritional assistance, typically single mothers, by extending informal tax that could become a formal one, and this was associated with the possibility of achieving universal health care. On the 24th of March, however, it was suggested that big tech would emerge stronger than ever. Amazon was said to be hiring 200,000 warehouse workers. Facebook and Microsoft traffic accelerated trends that were already benefiting them. And Apple, a company that had closed hundreds of stores around the world, was looking as if it would emerge from the pandemic in good shape. Readers might be split on this one. I think it might be either good or bad news. On the next day, a philosophical theme emerged in a debate concerning the question, what is the common good in the midst of a pandemic? How do we maximize the common good in the least heartless way? The strategy of allowing the virus to run its course as quickly as possible in the hope of hastening herd immunity was said to be a callous approach, reminiscent of social Darwinism, the idea of the survival of the fittest, and health experts took a different position. When faced with shortage of hospital beds and equipment, for example, should we be saving years of life or rather just lives, as is customary in other countries? The participants in this debate said it came down to the question of what a life was worth, a sobering debate that I think will be recorded for future generations to contemplate. So this is my first topic of four, and I'm coming to the end of the first topic now. What I had in mind here is that it would be interesting project for someone to track the progress of these observation and predictions, the contemporary history strategy, and what would you predict, and what is likely that the pandemic, and is it likely that this pandemic would lead to international cooperation, the formation of global health network, especially as pandemics are occurring more often and in a seemingly more deadly form? The crisis we're experiencing certainly leads to an expansion of the moral imagination. And you might begin this little project by checking out the subheadings or the categories in the annual review essay that you had to read about epidemics and see if they're relevant or out of date. For instance, the concept of postmodern epidemics and postmodern societies, or the concept of risk societies, or something different, postmodern societies defined as a sense of unease concerning the control of our lives, done in terms of society's relation to nature, which was said to be the central debate in the coming years. This morning, while I was just thinking about talking to you today, I read two terrific answers to these questions in the current issue of the London Review of Books. You might have access to your library. Sometimes they allow you to unload one article. But I've got two. Anyway, the two articles that I think would be of tremendous interest are, the first one is Society as a Broadband Network by William Davies. That's on page 11 and 12. And the second one is Too Early or Too Late, David Runciman on Political Timing and the Pandemic, on pages 7 to 9 in the current issue, the April 2nd issue of the London Review of Books. So that's my first topic. And I'll put everything out of the way while I was switching phones. Here's my second topic. The second topic begins with the annual review essay quotes by Peter Slack's observation on page 34 that the shock of pestilence elicits quite similar responses in different historical and geographic contexts, and he provides a number of examples. What I found interesting, as you will appreciate in a moment, was the unexpected response to accounts of cannibalism that dismissed the findings about the Kuru epidemic. They arose in 1979 in a book published by William Ahrens with the title The Man-Eating Myth, which attracted widespread attention from anthropologists and the media. In addition to the reviews of the book, Ahrens was interviewed on the radio, on television, and in countries as far afield of Australia. He discussed famous historical cases among the Aztecs and the Tupinamba, and recent reports of the practice in Africa, and particularly in New Guinea, where the case of Kuru and cannibalism among the Foray received most attention, because that was the work of Bob Glass and myself. We proposed that was transmitted, that the epidemic was transmitted by cannibalism. The anthropologists Ronald and Catherine Burns had worked among the North Foray during the late. Ahrens questioned Glass and Lindenbaum's proposal that the cannibalism was the principal means of transmitting the fatal infection, but because he said the evidence was circumstantial. The anthropologist Ronald and Catherine Burns had worked in the North Foray during the late 1950s at a time when cannibalism had ceased 4 years earlier. Since we arrived in the South Foray in 1961, Ahrens erroneously concluded that we had relied on Burns' idiosyncratic discussion of the material. As you will hear in my discussion of topic 3, Rob travelled extensively through the hamlets of South and North Foray and into the neighbouring linguistic groups, gathering our own information about the practice among people who had quite recently consumed the dead. We arrived 3 years after they gave up cannibalism. So the detailed ethnographic data provided information about microepidemics in particular locations, as well as in the differences between the North-South Foray. That is, people were talking about their own practices 3 years earlier. However, Ahrens' main argument was that he had been unable to uncover adequate information of cannibalism as a custom in any form for any society, and he was dubious about the actual existence of the act as an accepted practice for any time or place, except in recourse to cannibalism under survival conditions or a rare case of antisocial behavior. In 1980, in response to the book, a panel on the ethnography of cannibalism, anthropologists presented their ethnographic data on the topic at the annual anthropological meetings, and their presentations were published in a volume edited by Donald Tusen and Paula Brown in 1983. The case of Kuru was presented by them as evidence that cannibalism had existed. The Royal Anthropological Newsletter, also in 1980, called the book Bold Exploration, but that Ahrens' use of was so limited that tend to appear to be secondary to the desire to create a publicity-generating debate. Levi-Strauss weighed in. He said that Ahrens had written a brilliant but superficial book that enjoyed great success with an ill-informed readership. Ahrens' central argument, however, was that there was no evidence that an anthropologist had ever witnessed cannibalism. This was true, as I mentioned, because missionaries and colonial governments had arrived first in faraway places. So by the time anthropologists arrived, some customary behaviors had been abandoned. This was true for as I mentioned, for the people in the South Foray where we worked. The last cases of cannibalism had occurred there in the late 1950s, and we arrived in 1961. So the memories were quite fresh, and we spoke to hundreds of people. But Ahrens had stated that accounts provided by people describing their own practices were inadmissible, a definition that anthropologists found unacceptable. The anthropologist Ivan Brady's critical review in the American Anthropologist said anthropology's head was on the chopping block, and that by placing such emphasis on denying cannibalism through direct observation, this overlooked accepted accounts of behavior not witnessed, such as those associated with sexuality. One major weakness in Aaron's position was that he assumed that all forms of cannibalism were the same. But anthropologists define two forms of cannibalism. One is called exocannibalism, eating outsiders who are not from one's own group, often enemies, and more distant people, in contrast to endocannibalism, eating people from one's own group, often kin, who are consumed with sadness and love during mortuary ceremonies. This was a deficiency that Levi-Strauss and other anthropologists thought that endocannibalism had been widely reported in South America and in Papua New Guinea. So when people in these places spoke about the practice, they were describing their own behaviors, not those of their enemies or more distant people, which might well be overstated. Significantly, the foray practiced endocannibalism. Ahrens continued to write his last publication that I could find in 1998, where he found a place for his views in cultural studies, a new field of research that they define as questioning the and the reconstruction of cultural identity in the late 20th century world. That is, not a science-based kind of research. Rethinking Anthropology, the title of Aaron's 1998 essay, now focused on what he called the celebrated and alleged cannibalism among the foray of highland Papua New Guinea, and he said he saw no reason to revise his original premise concerning, quote, the mythological nature of these creatures, because the ever-present cannibals on the horizon of the Western world were the result of intellectual conjuring, including the anthropological variety. Well, over the years, I kept I had a close watch over the controversy, but I kept my distance and I didn't participate because I thought attention to a debate that I thought was getting out of hand, and there were others who were providing criticism better than I could. So there's a lot more criticism out there if you're interested in it. So what's that got to do with the corona? What with COVID-19? Imagine my surprise when I began to hear Raul and Sean Hannity on Fox News telling on the importance of the virus, assuring millions of Americans that the illness had been overhyped by Democrats and journalists undermining Trump. And more recently, that Fox Business anchor, Tricia Riga, had departed from the cable news network following her broadcast in which she dismissed concerns about the virus as a scam fueled by the enemies of Trump. You will also remember that Trump had accused the coronavirus modelers' work to be a hoax. And then to my dismay, we heard on March 29th that Antonio Fauci, the director of National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, a stabilizing voice competing with the title of disinformation about the epidemic, was now the target of online conspiracy theory that he is mobilizing forces to undermine the president. So Slack's observation about similar responses to different social contexts and geography was confirmed for me. There's one difference I should point out. Aaron's position did not endanger the health of the foray. His anti-science message was persuasive, however. It still held some people who don't read current scientific research. It is still held by people who don't read current scientific research. Neurologists have worked from the Prions Institute in London have shown that some women who have consumed relatives who have died of Kuru have a genetic adaptation acquired during the epidemic that protects them against prion-related diseases. It's a form of Darwinian, a recent example of Darwinian evolution. The prion, by the way, is not a virus or a bacteria. It's a misfolded protein. It's an infectious protein. It's a new scientific object, which was identified by Stanley Prusner, who received the Nobel Prize for this in 1997. And he defined the discovery of prions at the infectious age responsible for fatal neurodegeneration degenerative disorders of humans and animals. So Kuru has a place in the history of medicine, but Kuru research also illustrates the importance of interdisciplinary approach to the investigation of disease, and one that human scientists, as well as the human scientists and so-called hard scientists. The most recent paper from the Prions Institute in 2015 noted that the collapse of the foray population was prevented by the cessation of inbred cannibalism in the late 1950s, which interrupted the route of transmission and led to the gradual decline in incidence. Their data suggested that if transmission had continued through cannibalism, the epicenter of the affected region might have been repopulated with Kuru-resistant individuals as a population genetic response to the epidemic. That's a sort of a concept of what people are playing with here about a kind of herd immunity, which we're taking as optional, but the description that 2015 article was not optional, it was just the progression of the normal cultural behaviors. So I haven't seen any more postings, and I think at the moment the scientific data seems to put an end to public criticism of the Kuru data, but doubtless there are doubters of still out there. I should just add that the antiquity of cannibalism in human history has been confirmed by archaeological evidence of Paleolithic cannibalism among Neanderthal populations in six European locations. And of further interest, cannibalism among non-humans has been documented in more than 1,500 species. So that's my segment 2 on doubters and who always crop up, it seems, during epidemics. I come to topic 3, which provides more historical and ethnographic context for reading chapter 8 in Kuru Sorcery, one of the suggested readings. It shows that when we compare the Kuru and the coronavirus epidemics, we find some similarities, but also important differences. First, the Kuru epidemic did not arise suddenly and overwhelm the population. The first cases of the disease occurred sometime around the end of the century, in the 1890s, or a few decades earlier, and the last case occurred in 2009. So this is an epidemic that played out for over 100 years. Crisis occurred in the 1960s when Robert Glass and I began our fieldwork. Foray population at that time was in danger of not reproducing itself. The forays told us that in the South Foray, where we had our field house, the first cases they had seen were in the 1930s, which came as a surprise because the grant that supported our fieldwork was provided by the Genetics Department of Adelaide University in Australia, and we were asked to provide kinship information that supported a genetic hypothesis that the disease, and it implied that the disease was of great ancient origin. That is, we're talking about Mendelian genealogical genetics here, the earlier form of genetics, not the protein-based molecular genetics that became relevant later in the studies from the Prions Institute that I just cited. So with our interpreters, we had 3 interpreters because we were walking through two dialect groups and 1 new language. We walked with our interpreters and into the borderlands of the neighboring Agana speaking people, asking for information about the first sightings of the disease. The memories of first cases ran out in the borderlands. So we stopped at that point and we figured that the earliest cases might not have been the first cases, because probably it has to be an unusual number of first cases for people to take action about it. So, 20 or 30 years earlier, the geneticists are now considered to be an appropriate mark. So that's where at the earliest sightings were stopped occurring, and so we asked people, "What did you do with the dead bodies?" And they said, "We ate them. We consumed them in mortuary ceremonies, that in funerals." Wow. So we returned to the South Foray and asked people more about cannibalism. They told us the people who had died of Kuru and who they had consumed were predominantly adult women and children of both sexes, which curiously matched the epidemiological information provided a couple of 1957 by two medical investigators, Vincent Zegas and Carlton Gajdusek. Gajdusek was to receive the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1976 for successfully transmitting COVID to chimpanzees, confirming the status of the disease as infection. But to go back to their epidemiological evidence of adult males and children of both sexes, the match of the ethnographic and epidemiological data formed the basis for our proposal that the epidemic can be transmitted by cannibalism, which the medical world did not accept for some time. However, there was a gap of about 7 years. However, when the epidemiological information later showed that no one born after 1960 had come down with the disease, the hypothesis was accepted because cannibalism had ended in the late 1950s as a result of the government edicts and the opposition from Christian missionaries. One thing to note here is that medicine did not put an end to the epidemic, which is, the heroic stories about medicine sometimes assume that medicine did it. The relation between cannibalism and the infectious agent was not known at that time. So the end of the epidemic came from an unwitting kind of intervention. Kuru and COVID-19 are different in another way. Kuru was infectious, like COVID-19, but not contagious. It could only be transmitted by consuming the bodies of those who had died of Kuru, not by handling the corpse. So the Kuru epidemic spread slowly, following the first cases at the turn of the century, and as the bodies were consumed and these people died, more bodies were consumed, and the epidemic began to spread. This is the situation described in Chapter 8, which I was hoping you would read, which provides an account of the public meetings called Epidemics, in which people gathered to appeal to the sorcerers who they believed caused the disease, asking them to give up their evil ways. If you read this chapter, you'll see that was at a very emotional time. It shows how the forests responded to an epidemic that endangered their survival, and it is here that the similarities with COVID-19 become apparent. The scientific and epidemiological thinking is the same, as I'll explain. First, these public meetings took place across the entire South Foray through 1961 and 1962. The leaders from local communities and others attended the meetings where they were able to assess the number of cases across the region, but they had a correct demographic appreciation of the epidemic. They had an accurate measure of the devastation in communities across the region. They had the first step of requirement in an epidemiological survey. Second, the artists provided evidence of scientific thinking in their proposals for what could be called a controlled trial by proposing a test that would be imposed on all men. The women were angry with the men, and the male orators responded with their plan to see who was responsible for the epidemic. I'll now read this little segment from Chapter 8 in which this takes place. The women were angry with the men and said, "Why are you men killing off all the women, stealing our feces from the latrines to perform sorcery? We women give birth to you men. Try to find one man who is pregnant now and show him to us. Or go and search the old burial grounds and bring us the skull of bones of one man we women have killed. You won't be able to find any. You men are trying to wipe us out." This was a speech I recorded in December 62 of one woman in a nearby Camilla hamlet near to our field house. The men then outlined their plan, and I quote again. The leaders' scheme to force the sorcerers out into the open became more concrete. It was announced that the Luluas Tultuls, that's the government-appointed leaders, would return to their home places and state that they now had concrete evidence of ongoing sorceries. That they knew that the government did not agree with their theory of disease causation, that it was caused by sorcery. They knew the government said it was sickness. But they would return home and and say that they had evidence that concrete evidence of ongoing sorcery. The KIA, the government officer, could then send government tractors down the road to collect all the South Foreign men and take them to some distant place. There they would remain punished by hard labor. Who finished during that time of banishment, it would be indisputable proof that the affliction was caused by men. If not, Kuru was simply a kind of sickness, and they would be permitted to return. A woman then spoke for the victims. We women will ask the Kiap to send you men away to an uninhabited region. We would be pleased to do it. Women would feel no pity for you in your time of exile. The controlled trial, it's amazing. T-bongs were also very moving. The men, when the women stood up and gave their emotional speeches, the men bowed their heads and looked down to the ground, and some of them just scratched their hands around in the soil and couldn't look up. It was extraordinary. I have a third example, which is somewhat fanciful, but I'll try it anyway. In another example, a group of men about to attend a divination meeting enacted what I call a magical kind of vaccination. The group of men often seen as those who were killing local women would be invited to attend a divination test where they were asked to approach the corpse of a deceased person. And if the body evacuated fluids from the bowels, which sometimes happens after death, the body message would have identified the culprit. Therefore, I do not have our conception of biological death, but think that the spirit of the person remains in the body until all the mortuary rituals have been performed. So the body speaks. The men leaving home from our hamlet that day that I'm about to describe, armed with their bows and arrows, and they enacted a small ritual of protection before setting out. The group huddled together, and one man ran around the group spitting ginger on the ground as a protection. Ginger is used as a medicine chosen for its spicy qualities, and it's used in Kuru cures by indigenous curists. So in this case, it was used as a protection against accusations and possible attack. Well, they survived the ceremony, the body failed to speak, and I suppose that the concept of prevention was confirmed, even if it was based on unscientific input. It resembles the famous case, however, of John Snow and the Broad Street Thump in some small degree. In 1884, Soho, a suburb of London, was hit hard by an outbreak of cholera. Snow lived near Soho and gathered information that the workhouse, the prison near Soho, which had 535 inmates, but almost no cases of cholera. He found that the prison had its own well and bore water from the Grand Junction Waterworks, but a factory at 37 Broad Street, where employees drank water from the local pump, often died of cholera. He asked the officials to remove the handle from the pump. The public officials were resistant and did not share his views, but the handle was removed, and the outbreak of cholera almost immediately trickled to a stop. People who had left their houses and businesses in Broad Street returned. It's another it's a scientific intervention, but the cause of the cholera wasn't known until later, until 1883, when a German physician, Robert Koch, identified that the bacterium Vibrio cholera, the poison that Snow said had caused cholera. So my point in this little segment, however, is that the foray provide examples of scientific and epidemiological thinking, but add further evidence that puts to rest the notion that primitive people are irrational, which is a very old debate in the history of anthropology. So that's my third topic, and I have a fourth topic, and I'm coming to that now. There are many ways to tell the Kuru story from the foray point of view. That is, the story can be told by medical investigators from different points of view, I should have said. This can be told from the point of view of medical investigators, the foray, and the ethnographer. And I've presented the Kuru story in these three ways, albeit often intertwined. But there's a fourth way, which I have not published. This is a story inhabited by a dizzying cast of characters: popular science writers, journalists, comedians, poets, novelists, filmmakers, and a well-known musician, among others. The background activity hidden behind a veneer of scholarly constraint provides the story that is often fantastic and filled with error. I'm going to give you some examples now, a couple of them, several of them, but most of them are in the annual review essay. The fabrications began early on. A physician who had worked in New Guinea wrote an autobiography in 1978, ending what he said was his intimate knowledge of foray culture. 5 pages were devoted to descriptions of foray therapies, different forms of sorcery, the changes in gender relations resulting from the death of so many women. All this taken from an article I had published in the Papua New Guinea Medical Journal in 1964. The author said that his ability to provide such detailed information resulted from intensive studies on the social effects of Kuru, which was also the title of the article. I thought this scarcely disguised piracy had a kind of charming indifference to scholarly etiquette by someone who had a reputation for somewhat erratic behavior. I thought it was just amusing. Popular science writers, however, are often at loose with facts and let their imagination displace careful reading of the scientific literature. It was said, among other things, that the disease attacked victims at younger and younger ages. This is a misreading of the epidemiology. The reverse is the case. That prior to burying the body, women sucked the brain from the dead person's skull, licking through the straw as they worked and sharing it with their children. The foray did not eat uncooked brains, and the image of people using straws in the New Guinea Highlands in the 1950s is mind-boggling. It was also said that initial symptoms of Kuru and other dementias included self-neglect and failure to groom, bathe, or eat properly, which appears to be based on data concerning animals, not humans. And when Gardashik died in 2009, the newspapers of the world said incorrectly that he had discovered the link between Kuru and cannibalism. Gardashik didn't doubt that the foray were cannibals, but he had other ideas about how the ideas was transmitted. The obituaries also said the identification of the prion and the infectious agent was Gardashik's discovery, but as you know, I just mentioned, it was Stanley Prusner's discovery, for which he received the Nobel Prize in 1997. Popular science writers offered a number of alternative theories of disease causation. A French physician sent me some material in which he proposed that no infectious agent was responsible for Kuru, the Prion disease in cattle, called bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, called mad cow disease, or in disease in humans, called VCJD, variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which he said what stress caused diseases in both humans and animals. And during 2002, I received a series of emails from someone who disarmingly called himself Mad Cow Purdy, asking for ethnographic information that might support his view that resulted from digesting toxic materials. The Kori could have made tea brewed from sheep metal salvaged from the Japanese plane and then had crashed in the Eastern Highlands in 1953 during the Second World War. The first reported cases of Kuru had occurred half a century earlier. The popular press in Australia set a low tone at the outset, referring to Kuru as the laughing death, a sensitive and insensitive reading of the early symptoms of emotional lability. A 1973 Newsweek story told its readers that foray women, quote, still fall prey to Kuru sickness, a disease that literally makes them laugh themselves to death. And the jailing of Carlton Gardashik in 1997 resulted in a wave of yellow journalism, a term that originated during the late 19th century to describe the scandal-mongering battles between Joseph Pulitzer and Randolph Hearst, a form perfected, if that's the right word, by the Australian news baron Rupert Murdoch. The crisis in Britain over mad cow disease in the 1990s ignited an explosion of apocalyptic prose. In popular literature, fear was expressed about the epidemic spreading to the United States. A cattle rancher, subsequently the president of the International Vegetarian Union, expressed his concerns in writings and also on the Oprah Winfrey Show. A jury found the rancher, Winfrey, and Harper Productions not liable for damages in a lawsuit filed by a group of Texas cattlemen who had charged them food disparagement. Many creative writers turned to humor. A small sample includes a short story by its author said to be a comment very, very loosely on what was a true story. A French filmmaker the story from the perspective of Hindus who hold a different the cow. A witty essay about mad cow disease from the point of view of the cow. A poem called Mad Cow Disease and Englishmen. A chamber music ensemble by the American composer John Adams, which includes a segment called Hoedown, Mad Cow, said to be a version of the traditional hoedown, expressing the fault lines of international commerce from a distinctly American perspective, a whimsical reference presumably to the dangers of industrial farming, the feeding of cattle to cattle, and the collusion of the various ministries of agriculture. French cattle raiders held a sane cow barbecue in the Luxembourg Gardens in an attempt to persuade the public that the danger lay from dairy herds, not beef cattle. And mad cow jokes by the thousands could be found on a number of websites. A sense of postmodern pastiche and irony was compounded by popular reference to mad cows, mad scientists, mad bureaucrats, and rogue and ghost proteins. The Kuru story also found a place in films, DVDs, video games, and novels where fantasy roams free. I provide a very short summary of just two of them. Stephen Cannell's novel, The Devil's Worship, 1999, begins with Stacy, a USC graduate, investigating the suspicious death of her microbiologist husband, Max, said to have been a suicide. Max worked at the Army Medical Facility at Fort Detrick, evaluating the killer proteins called prions, under the supervision of Dexter DeMille, who is said to have worked with Carlton Kaisershik in New Guinea. So he knew all about prions. You'll recall it was Prusen and not Kaisershik who identified prions. In fact, who resisted the word of prion, clinging to his own concept of a slow virus as the infectious agent, which is not the same thing. I recall here that Kaisershik and Prusen were both present at the end of Kuru conference we held in London in 2007. They kept on the opposite sides of the meeting room and they eyed one another like wild horses. To return to the novel, Max had apparently discovered that DeMille was developing what would be called the first prion bioweapon, so he had to be murdered, referred to here as collateral damage. DeMille had made this killer protein more potent by mixing strains of Kuru and mad cow disease. The problem was that the destruction of the brain took over 2 years for the bioweapon and perhaps for the blood. So he mixed it with a strain of Epstein-Barr virus, the virus in the herpes family, which proved to be a perfect accelerator. You can see where this is headed. Stacy and her team, following a hair-raising confrontation and many near-death experiences, produced the use of this rogue protein in a biological war, the use of the protein in biological war, and save humankind. And in 1923, Hanya Yanagihara published a novel called People in Trees. She said the inspiration about her stories about a protagonist called Norton Farina came not from Carl Kaisershik's contribution to medical science, but from fascination with his notorious personal life, that he had adopted 50 children from Melanesia and Micronesia, brought them to live with him in the United States, and was sent to prison for sexual abuse. Yanagihara may have begun with a not too delicate intrusion into her personal life, but she adds her own elements of fantasy, horror, Indiana Jones-like adventures, and rumors of lost tribes who inhabit a fictional tiny Micronesian island. The protagonist, Norton Farina, has a great hunger for scientific recognition, publishes findings about a lost tribe and their amazing longevity, some are more than 150 years old, and while their bodies have remained young, their minds have deteriorated. Arena cat that kills a sacred turtle. Legend has it that the longevity of the tribe is linked to eating the meat of this rare island turtle, and takes it back to America, hoping he can separate the meat's benefits of longevity from the side effects of dementia. His publications bring advancement that are set in motion but set in motion the destruction of the island of the scientists and pharmaceutical companies searching for the secret strip of the land, searching for the secret, stripping the land of vegetation and wildlife. Forest trails are replaced by airstrips and island cultures, which are diluted, and their ancestral whales are decimated. I've got more to say about that. I think the time is running out. I think there's a place for some kind of fantasy literature and journalism. But the next example I was about to give to you is very damaging. It describes the foray in very savagery, the kind of terms, and very demeaning, actually quite repulsive, so I'm not going into all that. If you're interested in the really atrocious representation in one novel, I can read it out to you later. But what I'm interested in is I haven't explored whether novels are now being written about the current epidemic, nor have I kept a good record of misstatements, representations of alternate theories, and the jokes about the epidemic. But some of these are out there already, and you could identify them if you wished. This is the project that would reveal the way in which we are telling the epidemic story when it is about ourselves. So I'll put a halt there, and you can ask me whatever you wish, and I'll see if I can answer.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Shirley. Thank you for bearing with the technical difficulties, and thank you to everyone here with bearing with technical difficulties. I hope you could hear relatively well. I am interested in hearing questions from the assembled audience. You can unmute yourself in just a moment, or you can send me a message via the chat feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Just for those who might be completely new to Shirley Lindenbaum's work, just to connect a few of the dots that she actually connected beautifully, but just to provide a little more background, the disease that is the focus of her book, Kuru Sorcery, and that was the focus of a lot of her talk, is a disease related, as she said, to mad cow disease, BSE, and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, a closely related human variant of so-called mad cow disease. All three of these diseases are of a category of disease called prion diseases that Shirley's ethnographic research helped to reveal, and as she said, led to not one but two Nobel Prize awards for medical doctors, medical scientists. As more than one person has pointed out to me, Shirley has been overlooked in the awarding of these Nobel Prizes, and many feel that her ethnographic research was critical in the identification of these prion diseases. And that's, as she described, that's where the practice of human foray, eating their deceased loved ones, played a role in the contraction of the disease they call Kuru. But let me now open things up to the audience for questions about any of what Shirley discussed, its implications for understanding coronavirus and COVID-19, or any questions you might have. There's the usual moment of shyness. So maybe I'll ask a question, Shirley, that has been perplexing me. So really it's a kind of medical detective story that you were a part of, and one in which you had to correct a number of untruths, both coming from medical scientists and as you pointed out toward the end, from the popular media and people posing as scientists. And, you know, I've also been looking at Paul Farmer's recent work, which of course documents the kinds of really racist depictions of, in that case, Haitians at the early onset of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And those, again, coming from the popular media, but also from the CDC and from scientists. And in this moment, of course, there's this tremendous trust in the authority of Anthony Fauci and the CDC, especially compared to the president, who so clearly has been peddling all sorts of mistruths about coronavirus, as well as, you know, throughout his entire presidency. Anyway, but the question is, what are we to make of medical and public health authority, and in this moment, where I think many of us feel like we have to do what they're telling us?
Yes, I think that the disparity between what Saint Fauci is holding it together on nightly television presentations, right beside not coming into conflict with Donald Trump and providing correct scientific information that is going to lead to the resolution of the problem one way or another. Certainly, social distancing may be paying off already, and, you know, with some therapy in the future. You know, I think that public health messages are the best, of course, things to hold on to, and I hope that I hope that Fauci continues with his balancing act, sort of stroking the president on one hand and trying to make corrections in the crazy statements that Trump has said. But unfortunately, then Trump comes back after Fauci's spoken and goes into his rambles of nonsense and sometimes blots it out. There's always going to be a bunch of people who, in all these epidemics, who have an alternate theory of causation, and ultimately, you know, it turns out that there was one relevant piece of information that was the winner. And I think the public health, CDC, and the public infectious disease people are saints at the moment. So what we've got to cling to.
Thank you. Other questions from the assembled audience? And don't be afraid of, you know, I might have misheard something because the audio wasn't perfect. Shirley is incredibly understanding, so feel free to ask any and all questions.
I have a question. This is Patricia Sachs' chest call.
Oh, I think, is that Patricia? Are you trying to, I think Patricia's trying to ask a question, but we're not hearing you. See if you can turn your, I will try one more time.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay, sorry about that. Shirley, I am very interested in the nature of the challenges you may have had over the course of your career with the work that you're doing in this area, and whether you had interactions, conversations yourself with medical personnel around the nature of the voice that you're bringing about the perspective on these epidemics. Did you have occasion to have conversations or get invited into a conversation at any level?
Yes, I was. Bob Glass and I were. Bob was only in the early years, but I kept going back to the fore about 5 or 6 times, right up until 2008, my last time there. And during the course of that, I interacted a lot with all the medical investigators, some of them came down and initially in the early days stayed at the field house with Bob Gossames, with the Nobel Prize winner, in fact, Australian Nobel Prize winner in infectious disease called Macfarlane Burnett came and visited us. And we told him about our findings, and he initially, he didn't say anything to us that day, but later he published a book in which he said he didn't believe us at the time, but he was now convinced we were right. He should let me know. It was years later that I've read the book. But you know, I had a good we had a good relationship with Macfarlane Burnett. But on the whole, I had extraordinarily good access and relationships with the medical people who came through. Particularly from 1996 on, the Prions Institute sent a medical anthropologist called Whitfield collect bloods for them, for which he collected bloods from the few patients who still had Kuru, and also from patients who didn't have Kuru. And that collection of bloods, and I got to know Jerome very well. He came back and forth. He was in the field for 15 years with 14 field work assistants. They weren't there. He wasn't there all the time. He came in and out, but he was there a lot. And his field house was within a 2-hour walking distance between the two of us. And we were in close touch about his work with the Prion Institute, and I'm also with close contact with the Prion Institute people. The director, John Collins, has been in touch with me a lot. They send me their articles. When I have a question, I email Simon Mead, who's one of the authors of the early papers I quoted, 2003, just referred to 2003, 2009, and I've been asked to participate in a book that they're putting together based on people from all disciplines who contributed to the Kuru story. Now, the Kuru story has sort of come to an end. They're turning their attention now to Alzheimer's, actually, which has a Prion-related dimension to it. College was in New York recently. We had dinner together, and he was on his way to Connecticut to get funds to continue with Alzheimer-related research, because the funding in Britain for medical research is dried up. The Medical Research Council, which funds the Prion Institute, has hardly got any money to distribute anymore. So, anyway, to answer your questions, I think I've had an enormous productive and happy friendship relationship with. And Guy Deshek and I get on very well. People, we depart most clearly in our views of what went on, but he is an amazing person. If you read the other annotated history of Kuru reading, he's an extraordinary person, and Bob Glass and I got on well with him, and I got on well with him. We sat together at the Ed of Kuru conference in London in 2008, and my relationship with medical establishment was terrific. I'm critical of the literature, and I'm critical of the medical establishment from medical anthropology point of view, and I agree with it. But in my case, I have the happy circumstance of having some very close relationship with people who finally accepted the cannibalism hypothesis and were intent on their own avenues of research, which they shared with me, and I was no threat to them, and they were no threat to me, and it was a very harmonious relationship.
Shirley, we have another question coming through the chat that I feel like is on many people's minds. As a medical anthropologist, what do you think is behind the hoarding mentality of so many people during the COVID-19 crisis? And I'm sure the person has in mind people hoarding toilet paper, among other items. I think there are a few more questions coming in, and we'll get to them momentarily, but I wonder if you have some thoughts.
That's probably not a medical anthropology alone question. I think it's, people hoard during crises, during the Second World War and during other, disasters. Some people hide the stuff that they have and have the ability to do so, and the inequalities that are associated with these situations, these crises, is aggravated by it. I think this is unfortunately human behavior and not isolated to medical contexts.
Thank you. I think Josh Moses has a question.
Hi, Shirley. Wonderful to hear your voice. I've called you a few times to check in, but never got through. Glad to hear you. My question is a broad one. Given that most of us will be touched personally by loss from this epidemic, I wonder what insights you have from your many years studying epidemics around grieving and mourning.
Yes. Well, my association with the Kuru epidemic is with the grievers and mourners who, among the foray, mainly. My own parents died in their older years, and my wonderful brother just died recently, but he lived to be in his 80s. So I didn't have the loss of personal family to grieve for in an extreme situation. But I did spend a lot of my time in the field sitting with and talking to and grieving quietly with people who had lost young women, and women were the main category of people who were dying of Kuru. So, because they were the cannibals and the human flesh and the women and the children. So I spend a lot of time talking to grieving people, and they were surprised. They said they didn't have a whole lot of contact with Europeans. They had missionaries and coffee traders, and even when they went to the city, which was rare, they'd see other colonial situations. But when they saw me grieving with people over somebody in, I recall a young woman who I was tremendously fond of, and I was weeping, and they said, look, she's weeping. She's a white woman and she's weeping. So I thought that was an unusual and unfortunate insight. But I spent a lot of time weeping and grieving with women. And I'm now in contact, to my amazement, with somebody who was a little kid when I was doing field work. He was the son of our first interpreter. And he sent me an email about a year ago now, a bit more, maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years now. And I suddenly got an email from him. His name is Patterson, and his first name after his father, Kassam. And he said, my father, your friend, that was our interpreter, has just died. And the people in the village want to know how old he was. And by the way, how old am I? And this is a young man in his 40s now. And so I got out my diaries, and in those days, I wrote about everything. And so I told him that I could remember his mother coming on a certain date in the 1960s, and she didn't appear to be pregnant, but she had a big sort of a dress on that would have hidden it. And then she came back 3 months later, and she was carrying a baby, which was her first child. So that was him. And I told him, and he said, oh, he was so relieved. He said, and I said also, your father had to go out that night and catch possums to give to his wife's parents for the gift of the child, which was, had to do that. And so he said, oh, I think you're right. So we'll put I'll tell the elders, and we'll put the date on the headstone that it was in his 70s, and I think I have to change the census about my age. We have remained enormously close friends, I would say, since that moment. his son just died of mouth cancer. He appealed to me to try to get medicines, and which were unavailable in Papua New Guinea. I set himself up with contacts about that. We talked a lot about his grief, and he said sometimes he's wonderful. He's a wonderful young man. He said sometimes the first child is more loved than the others, and this child, who was called Christopher, was must be loved. And when you're in the field in Papua New Guinea, you have to make reciprocal transactions of wealth. You give wealth to one another, food or money or clothing or whatever, whatever you have, objects. And that expressions of emotion are carried with the object. And so I contributed a lot of money to, substantial payment to the headstone for his father. And then when he told me he was going home to bury his son, this was a couple of months ago, I sent him some money for that. And he said that a prayer would be said, they're all Christians now, a prayer would be said at the graveside for his son, and he was very grateful for it. And he came back from the mortuary ceremony, which took 6 weeks, and he arrived back in Port Moresby, where he holds a job. That's how he has access to a computer. And he said, I want to tell you something lovely that happened when we were singing the hymns over my son's body. 2 hummingbirds came down, and they twirled around in relation to the music. And when we stopped singing the Christian hymns, they flew away. And he said, I knew you would like that story. So I go through my grieving now in a kind of form of long distance research, which is tremendously meaningful. It's done by email, not by telephone, but it's endless. We send photos to one another, and we're lifelong friends. I just feel as though he's a real kinsperson, and it's really developed over 2 funerals and 2 sets of grievings.
Thank you.
I have at least one more question, but and I do realize we're coming up on 7 o'clock. There is a question that came in over the chat asking, I don't have a specific question, but just curious to hear any thoughts on cultural differences and responses to government guidelines. For example, social distancing.
Yes, I think that would be a very good thing to track. I don't have to check on it. I saw that the police broke up a celebration for the first year's celebration for a baby in a Black community somewhere in California, I think. So I don't know. I think that's a very interesting question that would be good to pursue. I have I don't know. I have a friend who I hadn't heard from for a long time from my fieldwork in Bangladesh, who rang me. I haven't heard from her for 5 years. Who lives in Queens now. Who said that she's very religious. That she was staying at home. Her children were out, observing social distancing, and that she's putting all her trust in God. And so I think, there would be religious and ethnic and class-related differences. I think it's a very good question. I think it's something that students might well follow. I think it's a great one.
Thank you. That's great advice. I think I see a few more questions, but there's one coming in from our class, which seems particularly appropriate, perhaps as perhaps the final question. Although, I'm sure Shirley might be willing to answer additional questions by email or in some other fashion.
Yeah, I would. Shirley Lindenbaum at gmail.com.
I'll put that in the chat box. But so the question is, do you have any recommendations for what we can do during this pandemic to improve the situation, either as academic community members or as community members writ large?
Oh boy. you know, one thing that I've had the benefit of, since I'm one of the oldies and alone and living alone, a friend put me in contact with Hands Deliver, Invisible Hands Deliver, which is a group of students who have just formed that take shopping lists from the homebound elderly and buy the stuff, put it on their own credit cards, and come and get a check. You know, this is what happened. I had a lovely young man who did this for me about 5 days ago. He asked he checked my list of things. He wanted to know whether, you know, the carrots were or little ones in a bag and so forth. And they bring food home to people who are housebound and who might be compromised in a health condition, with a health condition also, who shouldn't go out, but who need food. And it's called InvisibleHandsDeliver.com, I think. Just all together, one word, Invisible Hands Deliver. That's the first thing that springs to mind. I don't know what the cooperative research or intervention, I'm sure that active intervention, they'll think about it if anything else stumbles across my mind at the moment. If people, you know, send me emails about it, I'll ask friends, you know, if we can ask my anthropology friends if they've stumbled across any more situations where students can contribute. I think that's a good question.
In the spirit of connecting one another and mutual support efforts, I do wonder, before we say goodbye to one another, if anyone in the collected audience has any additional suggestions for things we can do as community members, as members of academic communities, as members of the general public, either organizations we could get involved with or specific suggestions for perhaps anthropological research or other research, or any sort of solidarity efforts that some might suggest.
I think one thing that we are able to do is to point out how some of the fissures in society are actually aggravated by the pandemic, and what this in fact means with respect to people, low-wage workers, people without health benefits, the whole range of things. And I think that, you know, we're in a good position to do that, and we should try to do it at every opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Mullings. There are a number of some of the most esteemed anthropologists of the last 50 years or so are joining us tonight, and Dr. Leith Mullings is certainly one of them. Anyone else want to jump in? Suggestions?
Just a small suggestion. I would second Leith's suggestion strongly, particularly given the sort of recurring message of how epidemics are always leveling or democratizing, or you know, nobody can escape. That's just not true. And I think the more that message gets sort of rehearsed, the more critical a response to the epidemic is possible. And second, a sort of corresponding documentary effort. I've been trying to sort of attach myself as a kind of secretary, wartime secretary, to some of the advocacy groups that are on a routine basis trying to form, resist, reject, or change ongoing policy and practice in public health with respect to the epidemic. They don't have time to document their efforts, but sometimes we do. And it's usually, it would amount, I think, to a story that doesn't often get told about the backstage machinations behind what actually emerges eventually as some kind of coherent or not so coherent response to the epidemic.
Thank you.
You know what? Can I just say one thing?
Of course, please.
Yes. You know, there's been a video that's been passed around among my friends here. It came from Cornell University, and it's a wonderful video of a guy who's taking care of the patients in New York City, in a hospital, a Cornell hospital in New York City. And it's very comforting in the sense that he performs again and again and again the procedures that he's now following, that he give him a sense of protection, though he's right in the center of the worst situation, taking care of patients with the disease. And it has to do with hand washing and all the time, and using sanitizer. And that's fine. It's just terrific, for people like me. But, the other thing is there's a bunch of people in New York City who live in apartments that have no running water. Can you imagine it? Can you imagine it? No running water. The hand washing scenario, doesn't help a whole bunch of marginalized people.
Which is true, sadly, of course, from parts of New York City and other parts of the United States to large parts of the world that are getting far too little attention right now.
Yes, yes. In Papua New Guinea, people don't have running water in the villages.
Anyone else want to share any resources or ideas? I have posted a few focused on mutual aid efforts and a few what I find to be helpful reports in the media about the opportunity that this moment presents to build solidarity and fundamentally transform our world in ways that were, to many people, I think, unimaginable as recently as a month ago. Anyone else want to offer a last word? Shirley, if you didn't know that voice, that was another esteemed medical anthropologist and urban anthropologist, Kim Hopper, who in many ways I have to thank for even knowing you. When before I started graduate school, Kim advised me, I think he probably had lots of advice about grad school, but he said, most importantly, if you have a chance to take a class with Shirley Lindenbaum, take it. It doesn't matter what the topic is, just take it, which was some of the best.
Hello, Kim. Hello, Kim.
He's waving. Feel free, if anyone wants to share any information in the chat box, links, ideas. There's some other suggestions coming in the chat box right now, so please do. But I do want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Again, Shirley's email is in the chat box as well. I'm going to unmute everyone. Maybe if you're not unmuted, please unmute yourself now, because I think I'd love to give Shirley a huge round of applause. And
thank you, Shirley.
Thank you, Shirley.